Welcome back to another YouTube video, and today we're going to continue the series on things I was wrong about. So on the Powerlifting Now podcast this February, we discussed cues that maybe we used to not use that we now do, and that's also where the retraction video came from in my last YouTube video. And something that Sean brought up of a cue that he no longer uses is knees forward, and he kind of mentioned how he doesn't use the knees forward cue, and if anything, he sees more validity in the idea of the chest up and sit back cue for kind of what he's been seeing as of recent. And when Sean said that, it clicked with me because I thought about it, and frankly, within the last year or two, I don't think I can remember a single time where I've really cued anyone to drive their knees forward. But I have at times cued someone to maybe think a little bit more of chest up. I haven't necessarily cued sit back, and I'll discuss how that kind of intertwines with chest up in a bit, but it kind of got me thinking. And I definitely recommend going back and listening to that podcast. I think there's a lot of great things that we discussed there, but you can also get more of Sean's thoughts on this topic and where this came from, because he had some different thoughts than what I'm going to discuss here. But when he said that, and like I said, I thought about kind of how I was cueing my athletes and what I was and was not using. And I tried to think about, why is this? Why am I not cueing knees forward when that used to be something that I talked about so much? Why am I cueing chest up when that's something that I kind of had got away from? Because a couple years back, I did a video that had a little bit of a clickbaity title. It's called Squat Technique, Drive the Knees Forward, and in caps, Stop Sitting Back. And I still very much agree with almost the entirety of that video. If someone was coming to me and I wanted to teach them how to squat and they really didn't have any background in understanding how to squat, especially in the context of powerlifting, I highly recommend that video. But where I was wrong is kind of definitively saying stop sitting back, because like with pretty much everything cueing wise, it's very context dependent. And in the context of the time I made that video, and especially about 5 to 10 years ago with what was considered kind of the meta and how a lot of people taught the squat, that probably was correct. And because a general rule within powerlifting, or just mechanics or technique in general, is the fact that we can't move further in a direction that we already are. So if we're in this meta of the wide stance, heel heavy, sit back, chest up, we can't keep pushing more and more into those positions. We can't be more chest up. We can't be more sitting back if we're already doing that. If we're already, in other examples, if we're already biasing a lot of IR, we can't get more IR if we're already at the end range of it. We can't move further in a direction that we already are. We can only go in the other direction. And as I mentioned, obviously, in that video, there are detriments to biasing too far back onto the heels, to trying to sit back too much, to trying to get too far chest up. But the meta has changed. We have shifted a lot in how we typically coach technique on the squat. And as always, when there's usually a shift, there sometimes tends to be an overshift. And now things that we once were not using and things that I was stating that maybe we shouldn't do, I'm now wrong about because they're more applicable because we've shifted so far to the opposite end of the spectrum. So to show this example, let's look at the natural tendencies of what we are going to do in kind of the old school versus new school squat technique. So if we are in this very wide stance, heel heavy squat with our chest up and extension bias, and if we go to squat right now, I'm naturally going to keep my hips back and my chest up. And my knees are really not going to translate very far forward. They're going to stay back, especially if I want to stay on that heel. Versus in the new school and the opposite end of the spectrum, this is where I'm saying of detriment, because I wouldn't recommend squatting like this, we are getting a lot more people obviously narrow and almost a little bit too forefoot heavy. A couple videos back, I had talked about how we can actually adjust our pelvis and rib cage position and our technique and our setup just by adjusting our foot pressure. So if you want more info of kind of how the foot pressure kind of does this, make sure to check out that video. But if we're very forefoot heavy, we are naturally going to translate our rib cage back and our hips are going to move forward. And when I go to squat, it's going to look like this. That's the natural motion, and then my hips are obviously gonna have to move back in some way, but the more I'm forefoot heavy, the more I'm just gonna squat in my toes. You can really exacerbate this. If you just go on your toes and just overly stay on your toes and go to squat, you're gonna go fully into your knees. You're not gonna sit back hardly at all. Versus if you're fully on your heels and you go to squat, you're almost gonna, I can't even balance, but you're gonna pretty much fully sit back into your hips. So where this initial orientation of foot pressure, pelvis, and rib cage is, is going to highly dictate what our joint motion is going to do. So if we're fairly forefoot heavy, there's not really a need to cue drive the knees forward because you're naturally going to do that. And so if we're in a proper kind of midfoot context where we're not too far back on our heel, too far back, too far forward on our toes, if we go to squat, our knees are naturally going to go forward. A lot of that initial orientation is going to dictate what our joints do. And like I said, when we get too far onto the end of the spectrum, we now are in this issue where our hips are actually too far under us. And we're in this depressed rib cage position, and we look like this, and we're now the opposite end of the spectrum of the cueing 5 to 10 years ago that I noted in my other video where we sometimes would run into trouble. Therefore, these cues start to become context dependent. There's very few people nowadays that I'm having to worry about being super wide, super heel heavy, very extended, and having to think about driving the knees forward. I'm more now usually dealing with someone who, rather than being in kind of this general midfoot stance, some type of neutrality with the pelvis and rib cage, is more so too forefoot heavy, kind of posteriorly rotated with the pelvis, means the rib cage pulls back, they're depressed, and now we're in the spot where we're 2 knees forward and not enough translation back and not enough extension. Because frankly, if we're going to bias one way or the other on the squat, we probably want to bias a bit of extension. There's a multitude of reasons for that, but to really oversimplify it, it's better to fight gravity. Gravity is already trying to get us to flex and round over, so trying to fight it through some aspect of extension usually is the better option for us. And so therefore, because of that, that's probably why, at least myself, again, Sean had some other reasons that he kind of notated, that I haven't really cued knees forward. If I have someone's foot pressure, either at midfoot or to the detriment of being too forefoot heavy, they're already going to drive their knees forward. I'm usually actually sometimes fighting the opposite now, where I will sometimes cue chest up because we get too far in this depressed rib cage position. And if I can get chest up, that'll kind of accomplish 2 things. 1, we'll get a little bit more of that extension bias, or maybe just be more neutral. And then 2, as the rib cage translates forward, the hips will go back. I personally haven't cued sit back, but I can very well see the context where you might apply this. But I think a lot of people, you can just be able to adjust foot pressure. You can be able to adjust a little bit more extension by thinking a little bit more chest up or adjusting that head position. And naturally, when you do that, even if I'm forefoot heavy, get the chest up, they're naturally going to then translate the hips back because it has to counter the fact that part of our center mass, aka the rib cage, is now translating forward. And that concludes this video on things I was wrong about with the sit back and chest up cueing. So going back to the video I did a couple years ago where I talked about driving the knees forward and stop sitting back. Again, vast majority of that I still very much agree with. But as the meta has changed, as we've gotten away from that old school sit back, chest up, wide stance, heel heavy squat, our cues are different. We're seeing different things. Most people are not having an issue having their knees and their shins translate forward because they're in an initial setup and starting position that already leads to that type of movement. And we can't keep forcing or cueing movement whereas we're already in that direction. Again, we can't go further in the direction we already are. So things like chest up and or sit back can be a bit more beneficial in these scenarios, and I was probably wrong about never using those. I see now the fact that when we get too far into the spectrum, where we're depressed, posteriorly rotated, too forefoot heavy, where now we're actually leading into the issue that we actually do need to sit back and get our chest up to translate that center of mass back over our midfoot and get back to where we need to be. As always, if you enjoyed this video, make sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, comment down below. I'd be happy to answer any further questions you have, and until next time, peace.